On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, tech rivalry, the fuel of trade tensions. The U.S. puts Chinese tech giants and investments through the ringer.
We must always be on the cutting edge.
And what drives the fertile imagination of a sci-fi writer? In tonight's Women on Top, the first female Chinese Hugo Award winner, Hao Jingfang, explains. Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Chinese Vice Minister of Commerce Wang Shouwen will lead a Chinese delegation on a visit to the United States in late August to talk with the U.S. counterparts about bilateral economic and trade issues. The Ministry of Commerce said that on Thursday. The upcoming meeting is a breather at a sensitive time in relations between China and the U.S. The months-long friction has led many to think deeper, such as worries over technology may be fueling trade tensions. Before we get down to our discussion about that, let's take a look at this.
Trade tension or rivalry over technology. On Monday, U.S. President Donald Trump signed into law the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2019. Which incorporated the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, mainly targeting Chinese companies. Though it wasn't an outright clampdown on the sales of Huawei and ZTE products, it bars their purchase or use by the federal government and its contractors for U.S. national security.
We're also making an unprecedented commitment to developing our artificial intelligence capabilities. In order to maintain America's military supremacy, we must always be on the cutting edge.
The recent U.S. tariff policy is largely aimed at China's high-end tech-focused goods such as airplane parts, flat-screen televisions, electric vehicles, and industrial lathes. Investigations over Chinese tech companies, the export restrictions, and the earlier White House report how China's economic aggression threatens the technologies and intellectual property of the United States and the world demonstrate that the U.S. regards China as an emerging competitor in the science sector. China's tech sector has had leaps in technology in recent years, including advances in 5G network, artificial intelligence, autonomous cars, and virtual reality, helping to boost the country's global sci-tech influence. China's search engine giant Baidu, the biggest Chinese online retailer JD.com, and the famous Alibaba Group all have been listed in the U.S., and even in the midst of a trade dispute, a young mobile platform called Pinduoduo also jumped upon its U.S. listing last month. But there is still a wide technological gap between China and the U.S., and many Chinese entrepreneurs are seeking opportunities globally.
For more on how the trade war apparently going on between China and the United States affects tech entrepreneurs, we are joined in our Beijing studio Andy Mok, founder, president of Red Pagoda Resources, providing consulting services to many of the tech entrepreneurs here in China. Welcome, Andy. Also in Beijing, Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics. In Las Vegas, U.S., we are having James Sun, a chief strategist of Zocus Strategic Marketing. Welcome as well. Let me ask you starting by talking about the trade delegation, Professor Gong. If you are looking at me for now, the trade delegation that Chinese Vice Minister of Commerce Wang Shouwen is leading to the United States, it's likely to be a preparatory level talk. Right. So what can be resolved if that talk takes place?
I think he is laying the groundwork for concluding a sort of a more larger deal, probably going to be reached at the topest level between the two sides, if they can agree upon the terms and conditions. I'm quite hopeful, actually, and I think I'm particularly hopeful because he is talking to David Malpass, the Secretary of International Affairs at the Department of Treasury, which is very important, I think. Steve Mnuchin is one of the cabinet members are more pro-trade and taking a less hardened position against China. So I think that's a good sign.
We are not sure about how individuals within the administration, whether they're pro-trade or not necessarily pro-trade, because after all, they're going to come to a consensus among themselves as well. So Andy, what about that? Is it likely to help us to see some potential of the dispute and conflict be resolved?
I think so, because I think, first of all, talking is better than not talking.
Yes.
So I think that's a big step
Meeting
forward.
is better than not meeting.
Yes, and I think this is something China's always called for, to say, China's always ready for dialogue. So I think that now that this is actually happening is a positive sign. I also think the timing is excellent as well, because with the congressional midterms coming up, there's a lot of domestic political pressure for some sort of breakthrough.
And of course, that also, Mr. Song, if you think about the timing, likely to be the implementation time of the recent tariffs that the U.S. has levied against China, and China reacted already. So obviously the first round of tug of war, if we could use that word, has already come to an end, with the effects of that likely to shown during that period of time. Mr. Song.
Yes, absolutely. There is definitely a tug of war going on here. But I can tell you from the ground, all the Chinese companies that I'm working with would love to have a wonderful and peaceful resolution to this, because America is really China's #1 trading partner, and it's the dream for so many Chinese companies to really work in America and to do business in America. And I think this is a situation that will be resolved quickly.
But Mr. Song, as you are not only representing Chinese companies in the United States, but also the other way around, trying to promote the U.S. companies in China, I just wonder, from your own perspective, don't the U.S. companies want things to be resolved as quickly as possible?
Yeah, in fact, so many companies have approached me to enter the Chinese market. It's so confusing to so many people why these trade tensions exist, because China and America are natural trading partners, and in fact, China now has so much new technology that it's developing on its own. And for example, we see in the case of ZTE, because of these trade tensions, because ZTE is was having these troubles, China now has so many opportunities to develop their own chips, and they're really going full speed on this. So really, the only people that are getting hurt are the United States companies that are really going to be under attack very shortly.
This is global supply chain, as we have repeated many times in our program that we are talking about here. So, Professor Gong, since all of you has said that it is going to be positive when they begin to talk, so the question is what to talk about?
I think the primary things, or actually two sets of issues here. One is, of course, the trade deficit. And I think the Chinese government is actually very clear on this point, that we are going to help with the US government to reduce their trade deficit with China. So I think we're going to increase imports a lot. There's no disagreement on this point. I think what the disagreement lies on is really about these structural things, as reflected in the Section 301 report, for things like China's industrial policy, state subsidies, intellectual property right protection, these things. But I think even regarding some of these issues in that report are some of the things that Chinese government wants to rectify anyway. For example, intellectual property rights. We are going to strengthen protection of these rights, no doubt about it. Premier Li, when he was in Europe, he was saying the same thing, right? So I think these other things are already in interest of China's economy as well as China's national interests. So I think there's no disagreement on these issues. I think the more contentious issues are precisely about state subsidies, industrial policies, and what else? I mean, it's like a restriction to certain markets entrance. I think these are the things that they're concerned about.
Well, there are a lot of issues between China and the United States, but one of the things for a negotiation is what exactly the United States wants. That has to be very clear. And as you may know, the long list that the U.S. has required for China to do actually would take quite some time. And meanwhile, it has to of course, coincides with China's own efforts of reform and opening up as well. So what is the plan coming from the United States? What does the U.S. wants to do? Or this is likely just to be a prolonged negotiation where the U.S. wants to get the best deal without knowing what exactly is the best deal?
Well, I think the U.S. or the Trump administration, in fact, is quite clear what they want. And we could put these into three categories. I think the easiest to solve is the trade deficit. So Chinese companies can buy more. That's relatively easy to solve. The structural changes around trade are harder to solve, but I think also solvable. So the Business Roundtable recently came out to say they don't think tariffs are the answer. They want to see market access changes.
And of course, President Trump has a very different way. So here's a blurring of voices inside the United States, but eventually it's the administration that is going to make the decision, as we know.
Of course, but I think the most difficult part to solve will be that the U.S. wants to maintain its technological leadership, and this is in direct conflict to what China wants. And I think that's going to be the most difficult set of issues to resolve.
So, Mr. Song, if you could set it directly, answering my question, that is, can you ask the other parties who are developing to not to develop, and not to develop in the areas that you are good at, but rather could only leave them to the other areas that you do not want to necessarily play a big role? That, to many Chinese, is exactly what Trump administration has been asking China to do when it comes to technology, for example, which is quite weird. Some would even recall the colonial days by the colonists asking those that has been colonized, saying you just cannot do something. After all, these are sovereign states. Mr. Sun, what do you think about that?
Well, let me tell you, I mean, I'm a big fan of Donald Trump. I've watched him on TV. The Apprentice was one of my favorite shows. You know, and
it's okay, whatever you,
really
you choose to believe or not to believe, but I want you to have your opinions about that, not necessarily in the personality, because he is the President of the United States. We're not interested in him as a personality. We're interested in him and the words he said as the President of the United States. It's no joke.
Right. Right, and but this is where, you know, even though I respect him, he is wrong. He's absolutely wrong in this case, because there's no way that this is how you know, civilizations develop. This is the way how technology is going to continue to foster and develop. You simply cannot not compete when you're in the positions that China and US are in. And I think the more productive way is to really think about how can we work together rather than competing with each other. Because as we know, this is something that both sides want to resolve very quickly.
We hope so. Well, as all of you have mentioned, the tech companies from China and the tech sector, internet companies as well, have been developing very fast. China really is catching up as hub of world's biggest internet companies. This year, according to Mary Meeker's annual report, China is home to 9 of the world's 20 biggest internet companies by market cap, while the US has 11. Of course, Chinese market is huge, as we know. Companies such as ByteDance, Didi Chuxing, and Meituan, Dianping are valued comparably to their American peers, and sometimes even better, according to that report. At least 5 years ago, China had 2 and the US had 9. This is just a matter of fact. Andy, I want to address you with that question, which is, what about that? How will the situation change if we see the huge backdrop of geopolitics changes between China and the United States? Will these tech companies, internet ones, whether they are coming from China or from the United States, a big loser as a result?
I think whether they are affected or not depends on their business. So companies like Tencent, like ByteDance, which is a news aggregation app, is focused largely currently on the domestic market. So as such, the growth drivers are really the China growth story. That being said, many of these companies are aggressively going overseas, but they're really growing in places like India, Southeast Asia, Africa. So I think that the U.S. trade-China tensions actually will not affect the market caps and the growth prospects of these companies that much. It will have an effect in the short term. Not that much, but there will be an effect, but it will be limited.
Right. Professor Gong, you see, Pandodo, for example, has been trying to list in the U.S. company, even though the stock market's been going up and down, but absolutely it has got some response in the market. Meanwhile, you also see today Tencent in the stock market, for today at least, is not necessarily functioning that well. But you also see Chinese companies, internet companies, just fighting all their way in order to be listed, both in the Chinese stock market and also in the US market, even today as we speak. So what does it say about the nature of these companies, internet companies as a whole?
Well, the internet industry in China is very competitive. I mean, this is probably the only industry sector that doesn't have a significant SOE presence at all. It's mostly private companies, and it's a vibrant industry. It's been growing very fast in exponential growth. But I also want to make a cautionary note here. I mean, the internet industry itself really, I won't say it represents the state of China's innovation level, technology level, right? I mean, I think at the end of the day, what determines the technological prowess vis-a-vis the U.S. are really in semiconductors, in material science, in sort of a more
the internet
sort of
company
hard
is more
sciences.
about the implementation side of it,
there's more
the
application stuff.
Yeah.
So I think even though they're developing very fast, but and there are many innovations, we also call them innovations. But in terms of the keep shortening the gap between China and the U.S. in technological area, I think still a long way to go. And we certainly cheer for the success of these internet companies. They need capital, and they are voraciously seeking capital. And the U.S. Public markets are probably more accommodating to these type of developments.
Right. Mr. Song, you also see the U.S. stock market rising up 300 points. That is quite impressive on the news that the U.S. China are beginning to talk again, at least before the end of this month. At the same time, you also see vibrant scenes of Chinese internet companies still going to the U.S. stock market, trying to get as much as possible, some cooperation opportunities. What does this all say about what really market believes? What does this all say about this vibrancy of businesses between these two countries?
Everybody wants this trade war to be over. I work with a lot of small companies. These guys are all, they all feel that this is a really unfair situation right now. And in fact, there's so many ways that, the tariffs are actually not very useful and not really being enforced because, for example, a lot of the e-commerce sellers that I work with, they're sending their packages over to the U.S. And if the U.S. wanted to tax additional, fees on these small consumer-grade items, they would spend more money on the labor costs of taxing these items rather than actually having them taxed. So they're just the packages are just still going through, and even though there are taxes, they're still not being enforced. So what's the point? I mean, everyone's just yelling from the rooftops now, but in fact, it's not very useful.
Well, probably they have to yell from the rooftop of the Capitol Hill. Probably that could be a little bit more useful than in the Silicon Valley. Having said that, though, let me come back to you, Mr. Mark, about that. Chinese internet companies, a very pioneering spirit. And Chinese people work very hard, and you not only see e-commerce but also blockchain and some of the new trends of internet companies emerging and flourishing in China. But if the situation are not as fluid as it used to be, what would that mean? How companies should prepare for themselves?
Well, I think what we're seeing, so it's not just the trade war, but I think what's the game changer here today is the new FIRMA Act, which is the Foreign Investment Review, Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act. And that's given a lot more power to CFIUS to block even private investment into American tech companies.
And the regulation is quite loose, so that there are a lot of maneuvering that CFIUS could use.
So I think some of it is broadly or ambiguously defined, so it leaves a certain space for interpretation. But I think the challenge from a entrepreneurship and a startup investment perspective is that it can limit the capital available for American companies to grow, but it also slow down, I think, the rate of innovation in China and around the world.
Professor Gong, what does that mean to the Chinese companies? Really, should they be thinking about the winter?
Yeah, I think they should be better prepared for this. I'm concerned about something much, much graver than this. For example, I don't think it's unimaginable that the Trump administration might even cut off technological exchanges at the university level, for example. He's already talking about making things difficult for Chinese students to go to the U.S. to study STEM
But the thing is, what
majors.
does that mean if he's doing that?
Well, that's going to be a huge blow to China. That's going to be a huge blow to mankind. I mean, the technological innovations are results of exchanges of information, not necessarily just coming from U.S. or coming from China.
Yeah.
It's coming from mankind, right? So just cutting off that information exchanges, cutting off those scholarly exchanges is a big blow to the science and the technology community itself. So I don't think that scenario is entirely out of the picture yet. I think this is something he might be thinking about.
Right.
So I'm more concerned about these things. Actually, I just came back from talking to a university in the United States, and they expressly told me that this is a concern, that they're very much anticipating that for future exchanges between Chinese universities and American universities.
But of course, it's also what they are doing in order to prevent that from happening. We don't know yet.
It's very American. It's very American. America's not supposed to be like this.
Well,
it's supposed to be the melting pot to receive all the great talents from around the globe, and he's trying to cut off that supply.
We can see you, Professor Gong, very compassionate about an America that you used to know. Mr. Sun, before we go, we have very limited time. Do you think American companies, tech companies, internet companies should also be prepared? Because when you have a trade war, one party act, the other party must react. That is just how trade war works. Otherwise, you would have one party totally overshadowing the other party, which probably would go even worse than action and reaction. So, Mr. Sun, should American tech companies, internet companies also be concerned? Should they prepare for something they have never seen before?
Everyone wants to enter into the Chinese market. All the American tech companies see the Chinese consumers as really a top priority. So this is something that is really going to hurt American companies.
All right.
Just as much as it's gonna hurt Chinese companies and consumers. So we really hope for.
Mr. Gong, you want to have your final words before we wrap up?
Oh, I just hope that or Mr. Wang will go to Washington and come up with some positive results and resolve this issue once for all. I think America and China this relationship is the most important relationship for the 21st century. There's no reason for these countries to be at odds with each other.
All right, John Gong, Andy Mock, Jim Song, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, still to come on our program. In tonight's Women on Top, the first female Chinese Hugo Award winner, Hao Jingfang, talks about trending the fine line between reality and science fiction. That interview right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, the program coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. This week, we bring you a special series of interviews with female trailblazers, women on top. Tonight, meet Hao Jingfang, the author of the science fiction Folding Beijing. She was endowed with a special honor, becoming the first Chinese woman to win a Hugo Award for Best Novelette in 2016. Before the interview, take a look at this.
Folding Beijing, the best novelette at the 74th World Science Fiction Convention, tells of the struggle of a father trying to send his daughter to school in futuristic Beijing, an allusion to the difficulties that some current Chinese parents undergo to ensure their children receive a high-quality education. Author of the book, Hao Jingfang, said in the acceptance speech that while the book gives dark solutions to real-life problems, she hopes the real future will be brighter than her story. Established in 1953, the Hugo Awards acknowledge the best works of science fiction or fantasy and are seen as the highest honor bestowed in science fiction and fantasy writing. Hao was very calm and controlled upon receiving the award, but is now even more passionate about writing than ever.
I feel normal. So actually, I do everything for fun.
Your novel, Folding Beijing, made me wonder, it is more a science fiction or it is more a social critique novel itself?
It is a science fiction novel because if there is no changes in the technological part, there will be no structure of this story. But on the other hand, I do have those original ideas from everyday life. I did see those pictures in Beijing in my life. I used to work in some economic study offices that's based in the Guomao area, which is the richest place central business district. And then I really saw those decision makers, the policy makers, and those CEOs of the companies. Then after work, I see some other migrant workers around my home. They really had those difficult lives. I feel that in somebody's life in this city, they just don't feel there are some other people in this city. Then this kind of separation had the strong impression in my heart, and then I just try to express this impressive.
And you choose science fiction.
Yeah.
This genre to express what you have just saw and thought about. Why?
Because science fiction do give you the ability to change the world. Science fiction is the genre about possibilities. You can just manipulate this world and give new settings to the world, and then you can create your story. But in the pure literature genre, you have to be honest to the outside world. You have to keep the world as it is.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm quite optimistic in human. I do think that humans are getting better and better. We can know each other better. We can understand, respect to each other. But on the other hand, I feel that there are some natural laws that exist in the human society, that a perfect society will not be eternal perfect society will not be true. We still have to fight with some common fate. So on this sense, I'm not very optimistic.
Talking about Folding Beijing, was it because you are optimistic about seeking solutions to the problem of social divide you just talked about, that you use the genre of science fiction? Or actually, it is such a difficult issue to be resolved that you have to seek the help of a science fiction in order to point out the issue and yet at the same time do not have to face it yourself?
I really don't think the solutions in Folding Beijing is a good solution. It's a quite dark one, and I don't hope it to be true in the future. I think that if in the most optimistic view, what we can do is we try to educate those low-skilled workers, those low-income people, and try to transfer them into the next era and try to help them to just get involved into the new businesses. That's the optimistic view and the solutions for this problem.
The Hugo Award was given to the first Chinese writer in 2015. Liu Cixin wrote the science fiction novel The ThreeBody Problem that was met with rave reviews. The book discusses human responses to alien invasions and other issues common to all of humanity. It has sold more than 1 million copies in China and will hit the big screen soon.
Developing sci-fi movies is the trend now. That is highly likely to drive the public's interest back toward sci-fi literature. Chinese science fiction should adapt to this trend in the new media era.
However, China's science fiction market is still in its infancy. There are only about 200 Chinese science fiction novelists, and the number of those highly regarded in the genre are fewer than 30, far behind countries like the US and Japan. How is the level of sci-fi related to the creativity of the country or the capability of writers to combine realities and aspirations? Hao Jingfang has her own answers.
After Liu Cixin winning the award, you also got the Hugo Award. Many wonder, where is the real level of Chinese science fiction? Are we really there?
Actually, I think that the Chinese writers are already very creative ever since 20 years ago. We have a circle of the sci-fi writers in China, and I always feel the creativity and encouragement from all the other authors. And I myself got a lot of inspirational ideas from the others. I do have the confidence in Chinese science fiction writers. I think that it's just perhaps time for the world to know China.
But people would compare, let's just say, Stephen King, George Martin. Their works, you see their works in every airport around the world. And they write, of course, in English, which is easier to spread around. But where is the future of Chinese sci-fi writers? I mean, internationally speaking, just be frank.
I think that the younger generation writers should have more time to just devote themselves into some longer works, because that needs a lot of energies and a lot of time for you to create such a huge world. But perhaps the younger writers in China now just enjoy some interesting small pieces. Only a small number of writers wrote the longer novels. I do hope that these young writers would create such a huge world in the future.
But why would they do that? I mean, they could do small work and they could just be famous. And people want to have a fast track to reputation, success. Do you think they will be able to be like you, to really sit down there every day, 2 to 3 hours, consistent, no matter what it means?
Actually, I think that the reason for one writer to finish such a huge work is the passion. You should have the passion in writing itself. You have all those imagined worlds in your head. You just want to make the imagination come down to the paper. And this kind of creation process is so interesting that a writer can devote into it for years and years and years. I believe that George Martin and J.K. Rowling, all these kind of writers, do have that passion in him or her. I hope that there will be writers in China who have that kind of passion in him or her.
You are passionate enough.
Yeah, I'm passionate.
You're very passionate, because last time when I met you, we were talking at a big scale conference among all the crowds, you know. And then after wrapping up the morning session, you told me you have to go back to your hotel Later in the afternoon, I saw you again because you need to be there and make some remarks. And you told me you spent 2 hours in the hotel room trying to write something. What did you write that day?
Actually, in that conference, I wrote the beginning of the Han Dynasty story. Wow. Yeah, so it's very interesting for me because I was in an economic conference in the morning. I was in the Han Dynasty in the afternoon, and I came back to the economic forum at that time. I enjoy this kind of transferring from one world to another to another.
But that takes a lot of effort. I mean, when you write, you have to really get yourself there. This kind of switch will be challenging for anyone, writers included.
But I always feel that I'm always there. I'm always in the other world, in the writing world. I just sometimes come back to real life for a short period of time, and then I come back again.
Really?
Yeah.
How is that happening?
I just feel that everything is a parallel universe. I just transfer from this universe to another one, whenever it's a literature world or a family world or economic world. When I enter this world, I just obey the rules in this world. Another, I just use another language. But I am quite used to these kind of experiences. But because I think that all writers in some time in his or her life have these kind of experiences of entering another world, another world, another world.
Technology happening so fast. How much do you think, new things such as AI, such as virtual reality, all of these might be able to transform or challenge your works?
Science fiction works are about possibilities. They discuss how human would react in different kinds of situations, how people would feel in this kind of situation, how people will react to, with each other in other situations. So it is these kind of mental experiments that really interests me and other readers.
What are you mentally experimenting?
Now I'm most interested in the artificial intelligence. I think a lot about what's the differences between AIs and humans. What are the differences of their mental processes, and what does intelligence mean, and how and will the AI become super intelligence in the future, and what would that be like, and how should AIs and humans interact with each other?
Talking about creativity, where does that come from?
Actually, I found out that creativity just came in your life. If you're honest enough to the feelings of your life, to the everyday thoughts in your head, you do have that creativity in you. Creativity is inside everybody's body and heart, because we do have a lot of thoughts every day. When you read a book, when you meet someone,
right,
when you study, when you talk to someone, you have a lot of thoughts in your head.
But how to grab it?
Yeah, it's in a turmoil. But if you do have the habit of reflect yourself and just look inside your head and questioning yourself.
Yeah. How do you do that to be able to examine yourself and let your creativity blossom?
But I spent 10 years just questioning myself. So at last I found that these kind of experiences become the treasure in me.
That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.